I think we'll go ahead and get started. I just have a few opening announcements, and then we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cheryl Pemberton. I am with the Mid-Continent Public Library's Programming Department. I'm glad you could all join us this evening. I just have a few things I'd like to announce before we get started. First off is to please keep your mic muted throughout the program. If you have questions, if you want to go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will answer them all at the end as time allows. And I will be putting a link to a survey in the chat. I put it at the beginning of the program and at the end of the program. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to take that link and complete the survey, we'd really appreciate it. This program is being recorded. It will eventually end up on our YouTube channel. I don't know exactly how long that takes. Sometimes it's like tomorrow, and sometimes it might be the first of next week. So we'll see how long that takes. I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our presenter tonight. Becky Franklin is the older adult educator for Tri-County Mental Health Services. She provides support to Clay, Ray, and Platte counties in the form of presentations, support groups, and individual support visits to older adults and older caregivers. She is a licensed professional counselor and has been offering therapy services for more than 10 years. Previously, she worked in the hospice field and now greatly enjoys combining this experience with her current role at Tri-County working with older adults. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Becky.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for giving your time this evening. We do have a beautiful evening. It looks like the rain has passed through and it's left us with such a nice night. So thank you for taking time away from your evening to be here. But boy, judging from the volume of people that are here tonight, this is a popular topic. So I'm really glad that we are gathering together. And before I pull my screen up, because I am going to pull that up here in just a moment, but I'd love to hear from you just to even open us up and kick us off tonight. When you hear this topic, the words mood and food, what comes to your mind? And you can either take yourself off mute and speak that out, or if you want to type it in the chat too, that's fine.
Well, I'll start off. Mood and food. When I eat food, I'm in a good mood.
Yes, Kim. Thank you. And yes, I see in chat, I'm an emotional eater. Yes, thank you for your honesty. That's a common thing. Stress eating, that goes right along with it. Boredom eater. Yes. And I will piggyback on that. I think that's something that happened a lot during COVID as well, is that food became like our entertainment. That's what we could do, is we could eat. So we were home, we were bored, we weren't as active. And so I think we saw a lot of changes there too. Stress, emotional eating. Feels good at the moment to eat unhealthy foods, but then mood goes down afterward. Yes, very good. Very, very good. And we're going to actually talk about some of these things tonight, which is exactly why I wanted to open it up to you to begin with, because I think sometimes that gets us thinking, and it kind of just greases the wheel a little bit, that it's like, okay, why is this topic important? And then also, what does our mind naturally go to when we think of the connection between these two areas? So, as Cheryl said in my introduction, my name is Becky Franklin. I really enjoy speaking on topics like this. I've been in the mental health field for over 20 years, have been doing therapy in different settings, and then now I get to do presentations like this. And I think that for many of us, it is helpful to be proactive, to do things preventatively if we can, that are going to have a positive impact not only on our physical health, but also on our emotional health too. So here's a slide that I think illustrates that very nicely. we live in a culture, we live in a day and age that all too often we kind of think that mind and body are two very separate things. If you go to the doctor, a lot of times they're focusing on your physical health, but they may or may not give as much focus or emphasis on mental health. We are seeing some really neat models that are more integrated care models, where going to your primary care physician, they're now equipped to offer resources and support for mental health too. So I think that's encouraging that we're seeing some movement in that direction. But it's really pervasive, like even through our health history or interventions that we can make preventatively for our health. I think this model is very, very important. So I think tonight that's something I want you to keep just kind of in the background of your mind as we're speaking on this topic together, because I hope it does give you some practical ideas for thinking about the connection between mood and food, but then also even bigger to think about what is that mind-body connection. So to start with here, just to pause and reflect on this link between obesity and depression. So in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice, their research, their findings actually showed that there is a strong correlation. And so I want to break this down a little bit to explain. So it's like the chicken or the egg, like which one came first, and it can go either way. So the correlation is there. The causality as far as which one came first, it can go either way. So people who are obese may be more likely to become depressed. And so if you think about obesity and you think of some of the related risk factors, for individuals who are obese, they are more likely to be sedentary, they're less active overall, they may experience lower confidence and self-esteem. And so maybe out of that, there's increased isolation or loneliness. And all of those things put them at a greater likelihood of developing depressive symptoms. The opposite is also true. So people who are depressed are more likely to become obese. So if you're an individual experiencing symptoms of depression, coming alongside that, there might be a lack of motivation. There might be more of a fatigue or a lethargic feeling, less motivation. Also with it, like some of the comments earlier, just turning to food for comfort. So emotional eating, and all of those things can impact a greater likelihood of becoming obese. So I think those findings are pretty powerful when you think about it, that again, we're trying to show and illustrate that these two worlds don't operate separate from each other, but rather there's a really strong connection between the two. So let's look at this cycle here for a moment. So if we are like at the top here, if there is a trigger that is stressful, there's an event in your surroundings, or maybe your perception of remembering something that causes you stress. And so out of that, we turn to comfort foods. And so we eat the comfort foods, and like someone had said earlier in the comments, initially it might taste good, feel good. Okay, that's touching on this here. Increases our hormones and or sugar. So if we look at what is in a lot of our food, and we'll be expanding on that shortly, but a lot of our current everyday food is processed. So we are eating less food overall that is in its original raw state. And so there's additives and there's things that are put into our food, not only to make it taste good, but also to make it shelf stable, to make it last longer. And so those things interact with different things in our body. But what goes up must come down. And so if we're eating something that is simple sugar or carbohydrates, oftentimes shortly thereafter, we experience a crash. So not just a staying up and stabilizing, but more of a sharp spike and then a crash that comes down. And so then out of that, we're still susceptible to new stresses. And because we no longer are experiencing this emotional high, we actually have an increased susceptibility to new stresses. And so it keeps that cycle going. And oftentimes that does impact weight gain over time, not just once or twice of going around this cycle, but over a prolonged period of time. If this cycle is not recognized, or if there's not steps put in place to try to stabilize that, or to have other forms of stress relief outside of food, there's multiple components there that can go into that. So here at the top, whoops, let me go back. So we have maybe heard at different points that in order to lose weight, that we need to skip meals. And there's different trains of thought on this, but this today is going to come primarily from the correlation with mood and food. So looking at how blood sugar can impact your emotional and mental health overall. So missing meals oftentimes results in low blood sugar. And low blood sugar is largely characterized by changes in our mood, making us more irritable and more tired, just more fatigued. Another thing that you might notice with that is difficulty with concentration or memory, being able to retain information. So instead of skipping a meal, it is advised that you have healthy snacks. So having things like fruits, nuts, veggies. We're going to talk about in a moment foods to avoid and foods to try to aim for to keep your blood sugar stable. But overall, also thinking about the timing and the frequency of when you eat. Because another thing that has been noticed with skipping meals, and this isn't always or never, but it just is a greater likelihood for this occurring, is that oftentimes if you are skipping meals during a certain portion of the day, even if you don't feel hungry during that portion, so like breakfast time, that it's known to make it more likely that later in the day you may overeat. And so even if you make it through that early portion of the day, then whenever you do start eating, it may be harder to eat in moderation or to cut back on portion size. So this explains it a little bit more with just looking at the timing of our first meal being breakfast and being early in the day. So looking at the top here, protein. If we're eating protein, it actually slows digestion. So different than if we're looking at simple carbohydrates, which actually speeds digestion. We tend to metabolize that more quickly. So protein slows digestion, and then it helps to prevent those spikes and dips that we were talking about in our blood sugar. So those really sharp ups and downs won't be as likely if you're starting your day with protein. And then with that, it gives a dose of depression fighting, and this is a chemical that is released in our body, and it can also be present in some foods. So tryptophan is that one. So basically just knowing that if we are aiming for increased protein, we're going to stabilize our blood sugar, and that's also going to help to stabilize our mood. Within an hour or so of waking up, even if you're not hungry, morning low blood sugar that comes from fasting through the night, not eating, can cause sugar cravings even later in the day. So recognizing that, you know, a lot of times we may listen to our body, listen for the cues. Okay, I don't feel hungry. So then I know I've been guilty of that. If I don't feel hungry, then sometimes it doesn't make sense to go ahead and eat. So couple hours into the day, then I might find myself really hungry and some of those low blood sugar symptoms starting to creep in. And so then when I'm already in more of a deficit of low blood sugar, then I feel like it's more urgent to eat or drink something to try to make myself feel better, which oftentimes is a craving for sugar or carbohydrates. Instead, if we can aim for what's called complex carbohydrates, that's going to help keep our blood sugar even, and it helps you to feel full longer. And that's true of fiber as well. So complex carbohydrates would be things like whole grain cereals, steel cut oats, or high fiber fruits. And so if you have any questions about these topics, I always like to say I don't want to misrepresent when I'm speaking on this topic, because I am a mental health professional. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I am not trained as a nutritionist or as a dietitian, but I do encourage you. I always joke, I say I know just enough to be dangerous, but I think if it's an area that you are curious or that you want to go a little bit deeper with looking at your current food plan and what it is that you're eating and areas that you might want to make improvements, I think it could be beneficial to reach out and schedule with a dietitian or a nutritionist. And sometimes it's really surprising to see how much can be accomplished even in 1 or 2 visits with those meetings. So overall, this is what we want to look for when we're looking at healthy foods in our diet. And so we're going to look at things that we want to increase, and then we're going to look at things we want to decrease. And I think for most of us that a lot of these things won't come as a surprise, but I think it's always good to have a review. And of course, tonight we're looking at this through the lens of the connection between mood and food. So first off, for things that we want to increase, we want to increase omega-3s. And of course, we can get that through vitamins or through supplements. So at any drugstore or grocery store, you can probably find pills, supplements that are omega-3s. And for some of us, it's just really hard to get enough in our weekly diet. And so supplementing is always an option. But as far as food goes, and then we'll get into other supplements down there, if you can eat 2 to 4 portions of fish a week, then that's going to be the best nutrient dense way of getting omega-3s through our diet. And if you can't get that or eat that, or you find it hard to get it fresh, you can also do canned fish, but you want to be careful specifically to look and see that it is canned in water, because some of them are canned in oil or other additives that have salt, sodium, and other preservatives in there too. If you are frying your fish to prepare it, you want to aim for olive oil or canola oil. And if you're ever in doubt on which oil to use, even checking in with your doctor or the nurse at your doctor's office, they can give you direction on that too, because sometimes with things like that, there might be conditions that are specific to you and your health history that they could give more specific guidance. And then, like I was mentioning earlier, either if you don't like fish or if it's hard to get enough fish in your diet, you can either take those supplements, or other sources of omega-3 of threes are flaxseed or walnuts. The other category that we want to try to increase is foods high in vitamin B. And so that's another one that I think can be low, or we can have a deficiency. And these can all have an impact on not only how we're feeling physically, so maybe fatigued, sluggish, overwhelmed more easily, having a hard time concentrating. And so making a concerted effort to look at getting a stable dose of these areas in your diet, and then maybe just taking some time to reflect back over, even keeping a journal or a food diary. And with that, reflecting on your mood or any other symptoms that you've had while making those adjustments and those changes. So in foods with vitamin B, why these are important, for one thing, is they are absorbed more slowly. And so when they're absorbed slowly, we're preventing that really sharp spike and then that sharp crash. So if they're absorbed slowly, the food doesn't cause mood swings, the ups and downs. And so some examples of that are things like brown rice, whole grain oats, and nuts. And nowadays, as most of you know, it's pretty amazing. I mean, if we were to even just do a Google search of recommended foods for each of these categories, you can get a more extensive list to give you more options. Also, fruits and veggies. Earlier, you heard me mention we want to try to incorporate, at least as part of our diet, foods that are in their natural state. And fruits and veggies are wonderful for giving us fresh foods in our diet. And with that, they also stabilize our blood sugar because they are absorbed more slowly, and they contribute to our fiber intake as well. And then the last category up there is protein. For many of us, we have difficulty getting enough protein in our diet. And so there are surprising sources of protein. Yes, meat is probably one of the more common sources of protein that we're familiar with. But there are lots and lots and lots of other things that we can eat that can contribute to getting enough daily protein. So things like eggs, peanut butter, cottage cheese, nuts. There are pastas now that are enriched with proteins, things that are in milk, or different supplements like protein powder that can all help us to meet that dietary requirement. So the neat thing with protein is, aside from helping you to feel better physically and emotionally, it also helps to maintain skin, organ, and muscle function, and it boosts our immune system. It helps to keep us from getting sick. All right, so let's look at the flip side, and let's talk about things that we want to decrease in our diet. So first off, we want to decrease high sugar foods. So decrease doesn't have to mean that we have to cut them out completely. However, we do want to be mindful of how much we're eating, so the volume and the frequency. You know, a lot of times one cookie can turn into a handful of cookies, or a little bite of ice cream can turn into a whole bunch of ice cream because it tastes good. And it's easy to just let the volume of that kind of sneak in and get away from us. So a lot of times, something that helps with portion control is deciding how much you're going to eat of a certain food, and then portion portioning it out while you're in the kitchen and then taking it with you to wherever you're going to eat it. So if you're going over to the kitchen table or if you're going to sit at the couch, deciding in advance how much of that item you're going to eat and then only taking that amount with you. It helps to be more aware and more mindful of the amounts that you're eating. So, like we were discussing earlier, these high sugar foods, they're absorbed quickly, and that causes that quick surge of energy, but then it wears off quickly as well, and it leaves you feeling tired and low. Another category that we want to decrease is caffeine. And so with caffeine, it can affect us in different ways. It can trigger anxiety, especially if you're someone who is more sensitive to caffeine or to the amount of caffeine in your diet. Sometimes even something as subtle as the difference between 1 cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee can cause anxiety symptoms. Caffeine is also dehydrating. So we may think, I'm drinking liquid, I'm drinking caffeine, and so we may connect that with being a form of hydration, but caffeine actually dehydrates. So for every cup of caffeine that we drink, we need to be replenishing that with a cup of water before we even add to that to get our daily intake of water to be properly hydrated. Caffeine also can make it difficult to sleep. And of course, different people are more sensitive or less sensitive to that. But I do think that it's important to just pay attention to the impact that this has on your mind and body, because a lot of times this can be sneaky. There can be caffeine not only in, like I mentioned earlier, a cup of coffee. That may be the one that we most readily think of, but there's caffeine in other things too. So like soda, there's caffeine in some pop, some Coke or soda. Also, there's caffeine in chocolate. So just being aware of the ingredients in the foods and the drinks that you eat and looking at that total amount of caffeine intake and then the timing of when you're having that also. And then the last category here is alcohol. And so we want to decrease the amount of alcohol overall. So if we look at alcohol as far as the category that it falls in, it is known as a depressant. So being a depressant, it actually lowers or worsens your mood. So there might be the recognition that having a drink of alcohol at first maybe feels good because it feels relaxing, but that very same relaxing component can also be a depressant for your mood. So it can cause low mood, irritability, or even aggressive behavior. And so another thing that's interesting to know is when drinking alcohol, your body is using important nutrients to process that alcohol. So it's not using those nutrients to perform the tasks that our body needs it to be doing. So it slows all of that down. It slows our metabolism, it slows our processing, and so sometimes that can also interfere with our immune system as well. Alcohol also is known to interfere with mood, with sleep, with motivation. And then another one there that's good to highlight is efficacy of your medications. Some of you may have noticed when picking up your pills or medication from the pharmacy that a lot of times there's a sticker on there that says do not take with alcohol or do not drink alcohol when taking this medication. And so if you see that and if you're unsure of what that means, or if you can have any alcohol, or if it's just limiting certain amounts, always check with your provider first. Always check with your doctor, because that whole metabolizing process is oftentimes impacted when drinking alcohol. And so medication is prescribed at a specific dose and a specific time of day to be taking that medication most effectively. And if you're drinking alcohol alongside taking those medications, that's going to change some of those factors, or it can. And then lastly, alcohol too is dehydrating. That can be true all year round, but one of the times that we tend to really notice that and see that, or at least give a word of caution, is if it's at like a sporting event or something like that, and it's cold outside, and maybe drinking alcohol temporarily makes you feel a little bit warmer, or maybe not noticing the cold quite as much. And so then out of that, that individual can become more cold or even more dehydrated and not be as aware of those effects setting in. All right, so let's briefly talk a little bit more about the importance of hydration. And I really like this slide here. One of the programs that we are very fortunate to have through Tri-County is a program that's called Healthcare Home. And with Healthcare Home, this is a team of doctors and nurses that are well versed on the connection between our mind and body. And so they meet with individuals on how to manage our physical health. So being healthy and hydrated, having a healthy body weight, managing chronic illness like diabetes or COPD, or managing side effects to medications, because sometimes when you take a medication that you need, it may cause uncomfortable side effects, but you need to take the medication. And so they recognize that managing those physical symptoms can have a positive impact on our mental health. So they offer wonderful support, and this handout is something that came from their program. So for the sake of our time, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but if it would be of interest, I can send this slide or a copy of this as a handout over to Cheryl after the presentation, and then she could get it out to you as a group if you're interested in having that. So basically, this look at hydration shows that a large percentage of our body is made up of water, and yet it's constantly a balance that is in flux. And so we lose water, we lose 2.5 liters daily of water just in functioning. Just our lungs, we lose water vapor. Through our skin, we sweat, we perspire, and through our kidneys and our urine. So we are constantly having an output of water that we need to be drinking in order to replenish. And so by not drinking, we're not just staying even at a status quo, because our body continues to have an output of urine. And so there's other things here that I think are really good to consider with, especially as older adults. Our body may not let us know. Our response system isn't quite as attuned the older we get. And so we might be more dehydrated before we feel thirsty. And so, as some of you may be familiar, there's a greater likelihood of developing UTIs or bladder infections, and that can partly be because of this, but also just straight dehydration that sometimes we may not even notice until we're more severely dehydrated. Here's another slide from their program that does a great job of showing just how drinking water and also drinking it at certain times of day can really impact functioning for our whole body. And so I think that slide is so powerful because if you look at what water impacts, it's not just one part of our body, but it's everything as a whole person. So pretty neat. You know, here they say this is what we want to aim for. So 2 glasses of water after waking up, that helps to activate our internal organs. 1 glass of water 30 minutes before each meal helps with digestion. 1 glass of water before taking a bath or a shower helps to lower blood pressure. 1 glass of water before going to bed avoids stroke or heart attack. So is this a perfect science? Does it mean never will these risk factors happen? No, it's not a perfect science. But again, if it's things that we can do overall as part of our preventative health routine, these are healthy habits, and it shows how water can have a positive impact. So risk factors of malnutrition. And I think with this, it's really good to pause and recognize, just like you've heard me alluding to throughout the presentation so far, we certainly know that this is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but in general, as we get older, we may experience a loss of appetite. And with that loss of appetite and some of the other things that we're going to go over here, that can factor in with causing malnutrition. So we want to recognize these things and at least have a heightened awareness of those so that we can watch for it, not only in ourselves, but also with friends and family, with loved ones too. So with the loss of appetite, as we get older, we may also experience a decreased sense of taste or smell. So actually, of our 5 senses, there are changes as we get older, and being able to taste or smell foods in the same way, that can change sometimes the older we get. And if you think about what makes food so appealing and appetizing, a lot of times it is the smell and the taste. And so I don't know if any of you have had COVID and maybe during that time had a change in your taste or smell. I experienced that once in one of my rounds of having COVID, and it was a really strange sensation because it was the same food that I had previously enjoyed eating. And so I knew what it smelled like or what it tasted like. But in having it during COVID where I couldn't smell and taste it, it made it less appealing. I didn't really want to eat that food. So just to think of that as a point of reference, if you have experienced it, or just in general, to notice that a lot of times that's what makes our food so enjoyable. Another thing that's common as we get older is experiencing difficulty with chewing or swallowing. So there may be more of a risk of choking, either on liquids or on certain foods, needing them to be cut up smaller, or even like having it be pureed so that you don't have to chew or have difficulty swallowing it. And that as well oftentimes increases the likelihood of not finding it appealing. You know, like if you're used to being able to take a bite of meat, like a certain meat or a burger, and if you're having it as a pureed diet, it's the same food, but having to have it pureed can really impact how appetizing or appealing that is. So just keeping some of those factors in mind overall. Another thing that may change as we get older is finding it more difficult to cook or prepare meals. And that could be for a variety of reasons. So that could be inability, as we have it listed here, just not being able to stand and prepare meals, or not having the energy or stamina to prepare meals. But it could also be just not having as much interest. I've had a lot of individuals bring this up related to, gosh, it's a lot of work to cook a whole meal for one person or for two people. Or if I cook a whole meal and there's lots of leftovers, I never eat it all. And I don't want to have that much food waste. So I just don't like to cook anymore. So there can be a lot of factors that go into that. Chronic conditions and medications can interfere with our appetite, or also with how hungry we are. And so that can be a factor too. So not only hunger, but how we metabolize, how quickly we process that food, or how quickly it goes through our body. And then anxiety and depression can decrease the urge to eat. And those are things that can go either way. Like we mentioned at the beginning of our talk tonight, sometimes we can turn to food for emotional eating, and we're using food to try to bring comfort and support. But also it can decrease our appetite or our urge to eat too. So that's something that can go either way. And then lastly, financial insecurity may keep us from purchasing nutritious food. So a lot of times more reasonable food is shelf-stable food. So things like rice or pasta, things that are reasonable to buy and they last longer, but those are not as nutritious overall. So I think that's a good list. It certainly is not comprehensive, but I hope it gets you thinking in that direction, because we talked earlier about the importance of hydration and how quickly we can become dehydrated. But I think it is important to also recognize factors that can go into malnutrition as we get older too. So ways to fight malnutrition, and these are a variety of things, which is kind of nice. So looking at some of the things up here, we want to use things that are going to make our food taste good. So sometimes even something simple like adding certain spices can make a meal more appealing, or can even change the flavor. Like if you're having chicken, the spices that you use for one meal versus different spices for another can give it a very different flavor. Making meals colorful can make a big difference. If we're looking at our plate, and more often than not, it's all a very similar color, that's going to be different than having a variety of bright colors on your plate and just making it more appealing. If you're not hungry to sit down and eat 3 big meals, think about eating smaller meals and maybe even snacks. Also being careful, paying attention to, is there a reason why you're not hungry? Looking at, are there things that maybe subconsciously we are filling up on in between meals? And our liquid diet can have a big impact on this too. So things like coffee, tea, soft drinks, just little subtle things throughout the day. Trying to make mealtime more enjoyable. And I think this is a biggie, especially as we're getting older, because a lot of times it's just not fun to eat alone. And especially if we have been accustomed to eating meals with others, it's important to at least periodically incorporate that as we're getting older too. So we could accomplish that in different ways, but some examples are we could invite people over for a meal like a potluck. So maybe like you offer to provide one thing, so like the meat or a certain side item, and then you invite others to bring other parts of the meal. Or you could go out for a meal to socialize. And I always like to say, as a caveat, that it does not have to be a fancy meal in order to be meaningful. I have seen some wonderful groups gathered at all different types of restaurants, all the way from fancy down to our local Wendy's. And so, just finding a place that everyone can agree upon and going out for a meal. And then having friends and family help you to cook or even share a meal can help improve your mood. And so sometimes, like prepping multiple meals in advance and doing the prepping with someone else can be a nice way to divide and conquer. Or maybe even alternating, like if it's someone that lives close to you, maybe you could have certain nights of the week that you take turns preparing a meal and having each other over, or at least dropping off a portion of the meal to the other person. Another way to fight malnutrition is using nutrition supplements. Of course, with anything, it's always wise to talk to your doctor first, but this could be anything from like vitamins and supplements, or things like Boost or some of the nutritional shakes that you can take to supplement your meals. And then lastly, taking advantage of local community resources. So there's things in our local community that can help with this, whether it might be a program if you qualify, like Meals on Wheels, or many of our local community centers or senior centers. They have lunch gatherings for a very low cost, and there's also scholarships available at some of them upon request. And then also we're seeing more and more home-based visits for different types of professionals. And so including individuals like registered dietitians. And so when we think of a dietitian or a nutritionist, we might think of it in the context of, like I was mentioning earlier, like where we may need to make healthy diet changes, but they can also help address topics like this if it's an individual who is experiencing malnutrition as well. So another slide I just wanted to pop up here just real quick is an example of a food label. And so a lot of times, we may just pick up a food. We might, at our very best, kind of glance down at that food label. I know sometimes when I'm looking at it, I might just kind of look at like the main things up here at the top, like the serving size and the calories. But then beyond that, we may not really scroll all the way down. So I think this is really good just to give us a reminder, a little friendly nudge to look deeper. And so this also goes over some of the guidance, some of the protocol for things that we would be looking for. So we want to look at the daily value, like how much of it is meeting the recommended percentage of the daily value. So if it's 5% or less, that's low. If it's 20% or more, it's high, because we're not going to just eat that food for our daily allotment of meals. Also, with sodium and cholesterol, we want to limit those. Going down for dietary fiber, we want to make sure we're getting enough of that. And then the footnotes down below oftentimes can give guidance. So, like here, it's outlining this is based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And so we need to adjust if that's not reflective of how many calories we're eating per day. That may feel kind of like a lot of information to soak in and digest. And if so, that's okay. You're not alone. It can be kind of overwhelming. And that's where I think connecting with a professional like a dietitian or a nutritionist can be really helpful. And a lot of times they can even help you set up like a sample meal plan, and then you can go from there on your own independently. Some of you might be familiar with this. So the MyPlate image here is something that has replaced what used to be like a food pyramid. And so we used to have like just a pyramid structure that the bottom was the basis for what we were supposed to get the most of, and then a little bit less for the next food group, a little bit less all the way on up. But this has replaced that because they're trying to give us more of a visual association. And so if we look at a pyramid, we may have difficulty knowing how that translates to our 3 meals or our snacks or just what we eat throughout the day. But since we're eating off a plate, this is a guide that we can use to structure our eating habits. And so if you look at how they've broken down the plate on the left side here, we want to have a fourth, like roughly a fourth of our plate be divided between fruits and vegetables. And then on the other half is grains, so complex carbs and proteins. And so again, right here they have the grains as being a little bit bigger than the protein. And a lot of times for protein, you may hear with certain cuts of meat, just for portion size, you want to look at it as like the size of your fist or like a deck of cards for the size of the meat that we're eating. And then up here on the side is a small portion of dairy. And so I think it's really neat that they've gone to this, because even if it's not exact, I think it gives us something good to be aiming for. And then just to kind of pause and think about, if we were to think of the last meal that we've eaten, how would that compare to this breakdown? And not to beat ourselves up over it or shame ourselves, but more as a starting point, that if we look at like, well, my plate didn't look anything like that. Like maybe I had a plate that was half carbohydrates and a little bit of protein and a tiny bit of vegetables and no dairy. Okay, well, I know some areas that I can work on, and that's not uncommon, but at least it makes it constructive that even if every single meal isn't going to be perfectly balanced, hopefully we have an increased awareness of where to start. So I want to wrap up our time together tonight by going over some symptoms of depression. And since we are talking about this connection between mood and food, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware of what to look for as far as common symptoms of depression. And with these that are listed up here, you don't have to have every single symptom in order to be experiencing depression. But if you are noticing a difference in what your norm is, and especially if it's in more than one area, then I strongly recommend that you reach out to either your doctor or a family member, or if you go to a community center or senior center, you could reach out to a professional there. With Tri-County Mental Health, that's who I work with. We have a 24/7 crisis hotline, or you can also walk in at any point, and we have what's called open access Monday through Friday between 8:30 in the morning and 1:30 in the afternoon. So with symptoms of depression, the first one that's listed here is feeling sad. Now, I want to clarify, sadness is part of our normal, healthy range of emotion. So we are not going to always feel happy, and there will be times inevitably that we will feel sad. But depression is different than sadness because with depression, it's more ongoing. And the things that maybe typically would make you happy or improve your mood or would help you to feel a little bit better, if you are experiencing depression, oftentimes you don't feel an improvement in mood. It's more ongoing sadness over a period of time. The second one here is something that is often overlooked is irritability or frustration. So you may be sad, but you might also be angry, irritable, just feel like you're on edge, or it's hard to tolerate things that you normally would take in stride. And that is very, very common. When things around you feel overwhelming, then even somewhat innocent or neutral things in your environment might cause more feelings of being overwhelmed or frustrated. Other things here, a loss of interest in normal activities or pleasurable activities, reduced sex drive, libido. That's very common. And a lot of times it may feel kind of taboo to talk about that. So a lot of times individuals are going through that alone, and they might not realize that there's a connection with mood in that as well. Sleep and appetite, we talked about earlier, that can kind of go either way. That with depression, you can either want to sleep more or you can have a hard time sleeping. With eating, you can either turn to food for comfort or you can lose your appetite. You might feel agitated. You might feel restless, like it's hard to sit still. Also, you could experience slowed thinking or body movements. I've had people say, I can do all my daily tasks, but it feels like I'm moving through quicksand. It's really, really hard to get everything done, and it takes more effort. Indecisiveness or distractibility, and that also comes into play over here with difficulty concentrating or making decisions, or difficulty with memory. Sometimes people will describe this as brain fog, just seeming like, I'm kind of walking through life, but I'm not feeling connected with everything around me. Fatigue, lethargy, feeling tired, and sometimes that's even after getting plenty of sleep and still waking up feeling tired, feeling worthless, guilty. And again, we're not talking about passing symptoms of that, but more ongoing. Crying spells, feeling like your emotions are just right under the surface. And then unexplained aches and pains. Now, we all have aches and pains or an occasional headache, but if you're noticing an increase in your aches and pains, or how long they last, or how often they come on, and especially if it's alongside some of these other symptoms, it may be worth reaching out to your doctor. And then last but not least, down here, thoughts of death, dying, or suicide. And so oftentimes with depression, when things are feeling very overwhelming and the pleasurable things in your life are feeling smaller or minimized, it can be something that over time it cultivates a sense of, I just want this to stop. I just want it to get better. And there are treatment options of all different types, but depression can oftentimes make you feel very alone when you're in the middle of it. So that's why I always want to highlight that there are options to reach out to more than one type of person if you're experiencing symptoms of depression, because oftentimes there's power in just even telling one person. It can give a little bit, just one little baby step towards feeling more hopeful that there's a way to stop the pain. There's a way out. I am going to also just put this up here. There's a lot of overlap, but some symptoms are unique for depression, specifically in older adults. I think some of the main things are just looking for medical health concerns and whether those are there without emotional symptoms, or if there's any overlap with emotional symptoms too. And also, of course, just to always be on the lookout for any delusions or hallucinations that can sometimes come alongside depression in older adulthood. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up for tonight. And I see we have some comments in the chat up here. So I'll take a look at those, and if anyone else has any other questions too. Oh, good. Okay. So looking here, Mary Beth, thank you for sharing, and thank you for joining us tonight too. I see some familiar faces on here, which is great. So yeah, Mary Beth had shared Liberty Silver Center has meals Monday through Friday at the Liberty Community Center. They only cost $2, but you have to call for a reservation by noon the day before. They are good meals and they vary every day. That's good, because I realize that's not always the case. Menu is online, and you don't have to be a member of the community center or live in Liberty. Even if you come in alone and don't know anyone, they make sure you are sitting with others. Very good. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. So another question here or comment, and I'm really glad you're bringing this up. How do the impacts of menopause on mood differ from the other symptoms of depression? They seem very similar. Yes, that is a good question. And the culprit of menopause. So with depression, I mean, there can be a couple of different distinct factors, but with depression, it tends to be more pervasive, more ongoing, that it wouldn't be like a specific onset or stopping point. So something that may not have a correlation with things like hormonal changes or a certain age. Although an individual who is going through menopause symptoms may also experience symptoms of depression. So I know sometimes it can seem like depression is being caused or more discrete to that time, but I think it typically is like in that order, you know, that if an individual's going through a lot of changes or difficult symptoms that they're coping with because of menopause, then they may start to also experience symptoms of depression. But of course, not always. You know, it can originate in different ways or overlap in different ways. I do think talking to either your general practitioner or your OBGYN can be really, really good for that, because there's a lot of new advances as far as blood tests or treatment options, or just helping you to get an accurate diagnosis that oftentimes can feel empowering, even if you are still going through that transition over a prolonged period of time. Oh, thank you. So I see some of your kind words here. Great presentation. You're welcome, you guys. I love being with you. This is wonderful. All right. Well, I think I saw all the questions. Does anyone else want to, I'm going to take this down. Does anyone else want to share any thoughts or questions as we're wrapping up?
I would like to remind everyone if they wouldn't just take a moment, take that link and fill out the survey when we're finished. I would really appreciate it. Let's see. Okay, looks like things are quieting down in the chat. Good. Yes,
Very
very well
good.
presented.
No, thank you.
Okay, well,
Well,
yeah.
I'm happy to send over those worksheets to you as well, if you'd like me to do so. And then if you want to send it out to the group, you can.
I can do that tomorrow morning. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. I'll look forward to the handouts tomorrow, and I hope to see you at future programs. Thank you so much, Becky. We really
You're
appreciate it.
welcome.
Ready. Good night, everyone.
Have a good night.